Hello. I talked about Mark Clark a few months ago and what happened during the Salerno landings in September of 1943. I kind of thought today I'd continue discussing Clark into 1944, and again why I think he was not a very good commander. Now, the months after Salerno, of course, the hope was that the American Army and the British would land at Salerno. They'd link up with the 8th Army, the British 8th Army, that was driving up from the south, and they would push north toward Rome. It doesn't work out like that. And the 5th Army engages in kind of a slow, painful slog, and what makes it so difficult, of course, is the mountainous terrain provides really good defenses for the Germans that are trying to defend it. Joseph Goebbels at this time, I think it was late 43, he actually stated in his diary, he wrote in his diary, quote, "We have achieved great military defensive successes in Italy. The English and Americans are simply not advancing and must pay for every kilometer of ground with rivers of blood." Ernie Pyle, he was with the 5th Army at this time, and he noticed a lot of the problems that the 5th Army was facing. He said, quote, "The land and the weather are both against us. It rains and rains. Vehicles bog down and temporary bridges wash out. The country is shockingly beautiful and just as shockingly hard to capture from the enemy." He noted there were, rocks, hills, virtually inaccessible from the valleys, and he stated that this was because, quote, "the Germans look down upon you and would let you have it." He also noted that, a small number of Germans could hold these fortified positions in the heights. He said, quote, "they can hold out for a long time against tremendous onslaughts." He remained optimistic that the 5th Army would eventually get to Rome, but he noted, quote, "the way is cruel. Right this minute, some of them are fighting hand-to-hand up there in fog so dense they can barely see each other, man against man." So this was very difficult fighting. Now, Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, fine general, good strategist, in December of 1943, he was touring Italy, and he was meeting with the Americans and the British units there and trying to get a good handle on the situation. He met with Montgomery, and Alan Brooke wrote in his diary that, quote, "I can see that he does not feel that Clark is running the 5th Army right." Further, he also wrote that, quote, "I must now see during the next few days what hopes rest in the plans of the 5th Army. Frankly, I am rather depressed with what I have seen and heard today." He met Clark a few days later, had dinner with him, and he wrote in his diary, quote, "I had a long talk with him about the offensive on his front, and do not feel very cheered up as to his prospects for the future from what I heard from him. He seems to be planning nothing but penny packet attacks and nothing sufficiently substantial." Now, this period of December-January was kind of an important time in the Mediterranean theater because you saw a pretty big transfer of command at this time. Eisenhower was, of course, going to England to prepare for the cross-channel invasion, and so the theater command then shifted. It went from Eisenhower to Jumbo Wilson, a British general. What this means is the Mediterranean theater becomes essentially a British theater. You have Maitland Wilson, Jumbo Wilson, who is the theater commander. But beneath him, you have the 15th Army Group commander. This was Harold Alexander, another British officer. And then you have Clark, commander of the 5th Army. So here you've got this kind of American army, which contained, it had contained British units, it will contain French units, but it is really this constituent element of ultimately a British show in the Mediterranean at this point. Eisenhower, as he left the theater, he maintained confidence in Clark. He wrote to General George Marshall, he said, quote, "Clark's presence with the 5th Army I regard as a virtual necessity until the Rome line has been secured. He is doing a very good job and is in the middle of the problem." They had kind of discussed, Marshall and Eisenhower discussed shuffling figures around. They had thought about maybe putting Clark in charge of the Anvil operation, but Eisenhower wants to keep him in Rome. They thought about maybe putting Patton in charge of the Anvil operation, the invasion of southern France, but that doesn't really pan out either. Now, the highest-ranking American general in the Mediterranean was Lieutenant General Jacob L. Devers. Now, Devers was Clark's administrative superior in the American Army. Operationally, of course, he's taking his command from Alexander, the British officer, the 15th Army Group commander, but he reported kind of for administrative purposes in the United States Army to Devers. Devers actually served as Wilson's deputy. And Devers himself, he didn't have a lot of regard for Clark. He wrote his wife, not long after he arrived in the Mediterranean, Devers wrote his wife, he said, quote, I wish I could rearrange some of the command setup here in the commanders. Clark is not a good commander. I have known this for some time, but it now drifts into me from many sources. And his opinion remains generally low with Clark throughout the Italian campaign here. In fact, a few weeks after the capture of Rome, later in 1944, Devers, in his efficiency report, he marked Clark, he rates him as 14 out of 27 generals of the same grade. So he doesn't have too high an opinion of Clark here. And in fact, later that year, by October, Devers rates him as, I think, 21 out of 27. So he's not... Devers has no great love for Clark. However, Eisenhower had a lot of confidence in him. Marshall seemed to have confidence in him. And Wilson even stated that he was favorably impressed with Clark. So Devers kind of has no choice but to accept Clark in that position at this time. Now, this change in command structure in the Mediterranean is important because it's also occurring at the same time that the Allies are preparing for a really desperate, well, I shouldn't say desperate, but a really dangerous gamble. They're taking a risk here. And that, of course, is Operation Shingle, the invasion of Anzio. The 6th Corps was part of the 5th Army, and after Clark relieved Ernest Dawley at Salerno, he gave it to John Lucas. And so John Lucas, he briefly commanded the 2nd Corps in Sicily, but he's in command of the 6th Corps, and he did, generally a decent enough job moving up the Italian peninsula. But they decided to select him for this amphibious landing behind the German lines. And the theory was if they could threaten Rome, the Germans would get so scared they'd pull out. They wouldn't want to get their army trapped, and the Allies could head to Rome. But this all depended on certain things, not the least of which would be speed on Lucas's part. Now, I'm not going to go into the finer details of the Anzio operation here, and I may do that in another video subsequently. But I'm really going to talk about what Clark is doing kind of on his end in preparation for Anzio, that is to say, with the bulk of the 5th Army. Clark's plan was, he believed, again, all things being equal, if the Germans had set up a really good defensive line, around Monte Cassino. It stretched across the peninsula, but its kind of anchor was at the Abbey of Monte Cassino, Benedictine monastery that had been around since the 5th century. And he's trying to break through that line and get to the Liri Valley. He's hopeful that when Clark lands, this will give him the opportunity, when Lucas lands with the 6th Corps at Anzio, this will give him the opportunity to do it. Now, the launch date for Anzio was January 20th, 1944. Patton at this time recognized that he said that the command was kind of taking a toll on Clark. Patton recorded in his diary that, quote, "The left corner of Clark's mouth is slightly drawn down as if he had been paralyzed. He is quite jumpy, and so is Grunther," his chief of staff. Clark understands to kind of complement the landing at Anzio, he has to launch attacks against the line the Germans had created there. And he's got to do this to kind of draw fire away from Anzio to scare the Germans. It's always good to hit your enemy in 2 places at once, or more places at once if possible. But he's hopeful he can do this, get to the Liri Valley, and break through the Gustav line, get to the Liri Valley, and then hook up with Lucas at Anzio relatively quickly. So the first phase of his plan here in January of 1944 was to launch the British 10th Corps, which was under the 5th Army Command, and it would assault the left of the Allied line to cross the Gargliano River. If all goes according to plan, the Germans would throw their weight in that direction, and then the American 2nd Corps, which was now under the command of Jeffrey Keyes, could deliver kind of the coup de grace in an attack across the Rapido River further north. So Clark tasks the 36th Infantry Division with the mission of crossing the Rapido River. Clark later wrote that he chose the 36th Division for this particular attack because, quote, "Considering all the factors involved, I selected the 36th for the initial attack because I felt that it had good leadership and high-caliber personnel." Indeed, the commander of the 36th Infantry Division was Fred L. Walker, and he and Clark had known each other for a while. When Clark was at the War College, Walker had been one of his instructors. Walker is about 10 years older than Clark. Remember, Walker's a division commander, Clark's the Army commander. But they'd had a pretty good friendship, and they struck up a pretty good friendship in the years after the War College. But as the Italian campaign progresses, and it's not going as swiftly and as cleanly as they had hoped, Walker becomes disillusioned with Clark, and he thinks Clark's plan for the crossing of the Rapido is just not a good idea. The 36th had been in the thick of the fighting at Salerno. The men were tired, the division did not have significant replacements, and the plan calls for this division to cross directly under the guns of the Germans. And the Germans command this brilliant position at Monte Cassino where they can see everything that the Allies can throw at them. So this is not a good... German artillery spotters are going to see everything that happens here. About a week before January 20th, and of course Walker doesn't know about Anzio. I don't even think Keyes knew about Anzio. So they don't really understand the urgency that Clark is putting on them for this mission. And Walker, about a week before the start date, he writes in his diary, quote, "I have mentioned the difficulties involved. They do not want to talk about them." Well, on the night of 17-18 January, the British 10th Corps attacks along the Carlisle River, and it achieves some success. It does push them back. And Kesselring, he later wrote in his memoirs, quote, "The enemy broke through in force at Castelforte, and the German 10th Army was unable to seal off the gap with its weak reserves." Now, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, he was the head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence. He had told Kesselring, he was quite optimistic. He said, there's no real danger of an Allied amphibious landing near Rome. Just concentrate on the enemy to your south. So with that in mind, Kesselring takes two divisions he kind of had protecting Rome. This was the 29th Division and the 90th Panzer Grenadier Divisions. And they had been tasked with defending Rome, but he gives them to the 10th Army. And so really, fundamentally, with the attack across the Gargaliano River, Clark achieves what this was supposed to do, what these attacks were supposed to do. Draw strength away from Rome to give Lucas his shot, right? To give Lucas at Anzio his shot. So these two infantry divisions are now coming south to face Clark. Perfect. Exactly. Everything's going as it should at this point. For all the success the British have, they don't succeed in gaining a secure foothold on the far bank of the river. So it's only a partial success, kind of from a tactical standpoint, but from an operational standpoint, drawing those divisions further south works brilliantly. But Clark, his desire to break through and reach the Liri Valley, it depends on the 36th Division. And again, Clark's subordinates don't know about the timing. They don't know why this is important because they don't know about Anzio. The two assaulting regiments that the 36th is employing, there are about 500 men under strength between them. And so as the division prepares for its attack, Walker is he's not on board with this. Walker does not think this is a good idea. And of course, you want a commander to have confidence in what they're doing. He clearly does not. He wrote in his diary, quote, "We might succeed, but I do not see how we can. The mission assigned is poorly timed." Again, he notes the heights. The Germans can fire their guns down on them. Certain losses to artillery fire that can be accurately spotted. Quote, "I do not know of a single case in military history where an attempt to cross a river that is incorporated into the main line of resistance has succeeded. So according to history, we may not succeed. The mission should never have been assigned to any troops when both flanks will be exposed." Clark actually calls him, wishes his best wishes, and he responds to that, too, in his diary, Walker. He says, quote, "I think he is worried over the fact that he made an unwise decision when he gave us the job of crossing the river under such adverse tactical conditions. However, if we get some breaks, we may succeed." Now, Walker is very pessimistic, and perhaps if I make the video on Anzio, it kind of mirrors Lucas's pessimism. Lucas was also quite pessimistic when he went on the Anzio, Operation Shingle. And both men have justification for their doubts. But here Clark orders Walker to send his men into an obvious, heavily fortified killing ground with understrength regiments and a firm start date. Now, as I say, the purpose of the British 10th Corps' attack had been to support, really, the 2nd Corps' push into the Liri Valley. But its failure to cross the Gargaliano in strength, it exposes the 36th Division's left flank. Still, Clark, no, we're doing it, we're going forward, we're going on the night of January 20th. Now, to complicate matters, German artillery had successfully taken out 29 rubber boats that had been made ready for the crossing of the river. So a lot of their boats are destroyed. Artillery also played havoc with tape that had been placed on the ground by the Americans to show where minefields were. Clark wrote that day in his diary, quote, "It is essential that I make the attack. Fully expecting heavy losses, in order to hold all the German troops on my front and draw more to it, thereby clearing the way for Shingle. Well, the result of the battle, as you can imagine, is predictably grim. Clark wrote in his diary the next day, quote, "As was anticipated, heavy resistance was encountered to the 36th Division crossing the Rapido. German artillery fire obliterated the constructed bridges that the division had put up." The next day, Clark calls Walker, demands he renew the attack, that he keep going, especially because a few Americans had made it across the river, had dug in, but they were pinned in place by the Germans. So Clark, he still thinks he can get through and establish some kind of a beachhead based on these guys that are across the river. Clark ordered Keyes to, quote, "bend every effort to get tanks and tank destroyers across." Originally, Keyes had ordered the attack during the day, but Walker and the division commanders, they protest. They say, "We can't go under such heavy artillery fire when clearly the enemy can spot us, can take us out. It's just not a good thing to do during the day." Keyes insisted. He said that the Germans were groggy, their morale was low, another big push will do it, right? What commanders say all the time. More wishful thinking than fact. And so Walker reluctantly made plans to attack at 2 p.m. on that day. He noted in his diary that, quote, "I expect this attack to be a fizzle, just as the one was last night." Problems continue to plague the assault regiments, boats, equipment, slow moving forward. Further delays occurred. So Walker's battalion commanders, they're the guys bearing the brunt of this. They're seeing their men die. They're saying, "No, we don't want to go. We don't want to go again during the day." Walker, on his own initiative, postpones the attack to 4 p.m. But in any event, units were so disorganized. There were so many delay problems. Morale played a part. The attack does not actually go forward until 9 p.m. anyway, which probably helped save a lot of lives. Well, Clark had been visiting Anzio. He returns. He insisted Keyes, attack, make the second assault. There were about, I think, 40 Americans during the second assault that make it to the far bank. But the soldiers that had crossed the night before, they were gone. Killed, captured, wounded, missing. And so from these attacks that occur between 20 January to 22nd January, we have at least 1,681 casualties. And that breaks down to approximately 143 killed, 663 wounded, and 875 missing. Historian John Ellis noted that it was, quote, "a 56% casualty rate among the riflemen and company officers." Clark places the blame for the disaster on Walker's subordinate officers, including 55-year-old William H. Wilbur, Walker's assistant division commander, and a Medal of Honor recipient for his actions in North Africa. The 5th Army commander relieves Wilbur, as well as other officers, and Walker finds this completely unjustified. He stands up for his men. He wrote in his diary, quote, "The officers removed were in no way responsible for the Rapido fiasco, but they were being used as scapegoats." A few days later, after meeting Clark, he wrote, "If they want a scapegoat, they should can me." As I mentioned before in the previous video, Clark does not have a lot of experience in high command. He commanded like a battalion in World War I, and then he doesn't command any troops in combat until Salerno as an army commander. He has no practical experience as a division commander or as a corps commander in battle. And he asks way too much of his men here. Way too much. And what happens here at the Rapido is a testament to his inexperience. If he had commanded a division, he might understand just what he was asking here. Now, the day after that last assault, Clark and Keyes, they go to Walker's headquarters, they have lunch, and they discuss it. And during this meal, Clark kind of offhandedly remarks, quote, "It was as much my fault as yours." Now, after the senior generals leave, Walker turns to a subordinate, and he has him prepare an affidavit swearing that he heard Clark say that. It was just my fault as it was yours. And this kind of admission of Clark's guilt. Walker feared that the public or the army might hold him accountable for this disaster, and so he places this affidavit in his diary. He wants people to know Clark said he was as much to blame as Walker was. Now, the story of the Rapido tragedy doesn't just end there. In January of 1946, 2 years after the river crossing, veterans of the 36th Division published a resolution that condemned Clark's judgment. And this is happening just at the time that the Senate's actually considering a promotion for Clark to the permanent grade of Major General. The document read, quote, "The results of this blunder are well known. The crossings were made under the most adverse conditions and required 2 nights to get elements of the 2 combat teams across. The resolution calls the attack a colossal failure. It asks Congress to investigate the matter. It also asks Congress to, quote, correct the military system that will permit an inefficient and inexperienced officer such as Mark W. Clark to attain high rank." Now, the president of the 36th Division Association was Miller Ainsworth. He actually testifies before the Senate Military Affairs Committee that Clark was, quote, unworthy in the position of leadership and command. Further, he said that, quote, "We are not complaining or attempting to deny that it was necessary to cross the Rapido River. Rather, Ainsworth's concerns were that, quote, the place at which the attack was ordered and the equipment and time that was given us in order to accomplish the mission was impossible." Ainsworth also notes Clark's lack of leadership at Salerno, too. And he says that succeeded in spite of Clark. Now, the 36th Division, of course, is made up primarily of Texans. It was a Texan unit. And so a lot of Texans, of course, were very unhappy, and a lot of Texans belonged to this veterans organization. There was a board of inquiry that takes place in 46, and it completely exonerates Clark from wrongdoing. In fact, the Secretary of the War stated, quote, "General Clark exercised sound judgment in planning the attack and ordering it. But since several historians have gone forth, Lee Carraway Smith, Rick Atkinson, and they note something very important, and that was not only did those initial attacks by the British 10th Corps across the river, not only did that succeed in drawing the 29th and 90th Panzer Grenadier Divisions away from Rome, but Clark knew about it. Clark knew about it through British ultra intercepts. Therefore, there was no reason to have the Rapido crossing in the first place. It was wishful thinking, it was hopeful thinking, and, of course, it was a disaster. For instance, Smith makes the point that if the Board of Inquiry knew that Clark had that information, knew that he knew about the ultra intercepts, it probably would not have cleared him. It probably would have found him guilty of wrongdoing. Unfortunately, the British ultra intercepts remained classified until 1974, so that Board of Inquiry did not know the whole story. Clark later wrote in his memoirs that it has always seemed to me that the successful landings at Anzio, where we might have been driven into the sea had not the Germans been busily occupied at the Rapido, was more than sufficient justification for the task to which the 36th Division was assigned. So it kind of seems that he's being a little dishonest there. He's not acknowledging that he knew about Ultra. Now, of course, Ultra was still classified when he publishes these memoirs. But he knew it. He was aware of it. Clark desperately wanted to break into the Leary Valley, and he wanted to aid the 6th Corps beachhead as soon as possible. But he already knew Rome had been denuded, and surely, because of that, the assault to cross with the Rapido could have waited a few days until the 36th Division had more men and was better prepared to carry out that attack. So, for these reasons, Clark, I think, demonstrated his lack of ability, his inexperience at the Rapido, really at what I believe to be a criminal level. You know, if the full facts had been known, he should have been court-martialed for what happened. I don't know how you can defend that, knowing what we know now about those attacks. And God bless the men who fought, and many of whom died and were captured there at the Rapido. This is further evidence, I think, of Clark's, really, like I say, his inability to command an army efficiently and effectively. And I don't think he was a good combat commander. I may do another video talking about him and the final assault on Rome, which I think puts the nail in the coffin of his reputation. But we'll save that for another time. So please, if you've liked this video, please subscribe to this channel. Please also check out my other channel, that is The Discriminating Gamer, where we take a look at a lot of gaming, including wargaming. And thank you for joining me. We'll see you next time.